Thanks.
Hey.
Hey.
Great to see you guys again.
Great to be here. Thanks.
All right. Nice to meet you, Mark. Great. Rob, you said your company was actually launched 3 years ago was it at MobileBeat?
Yeah, I was actually at MobileBeat, actually in a fireside chat with Rich Miner, the founder of Android. So
okay.
Excited to be back here.
Fantastic. Well, I can't fill those shoes, but we're very glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here. Bhaskar, it's nice.
First time here, so really glad to be here.
And you're the CTO with AppDynamics?
AppDynamics, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, this is a really interesting area to me, APM, or Application Performance Management, as we say. It seems to me that a lot of businesses are very aware that they need an app. They need an app that has a purpose in the world, that does people good. And they spend a lot of money and time to get that milestone passed and get their app out there and promote it and market it. But then there's this crucial next step, which you guys are concerned with. The idea that if your app doesn't, after you get someone to buy in and download an app, if it doesn't perform well in some way, if they get kicked out during a purchase, it's awfully hard to get that person back in a lot of cases. So could you just, starting with you, could you just talk about why this is so important a thing for companies to think about?
Sure. I think mobile has changed a lot in the last couple of years. It's really, we were having dinner with the CEO of Flurry last night, and he said, this is the time of mobile. Mobile is here. And if you look at all the statistics, eBay reported they're doing $22 billion worth of revenue just from mobile alone. PayPal's $27 billion. Facebook's 57% of their revenue is coming from mobile, and it's not a world where it's just slingshots of birds flying and destroying buildings. It's a world where real businesses are built on top of mobile. And we've seen one of our customers, Urban Outfitters, for example, is moving all of their cash registers to iPads, for example. And we've seen this not from even companies you wouldn't expect. Trucking companies are using iPads to track shipments. We've seen companies like oil sensors connecting those to mobile devices. So there's real revenue at stake. And if any of these devices go down, it really costs these monies real impact to their bottom line.
Yeah, I think really good examples by Rob in terms of how it's becoming more critical. But if you really think about it, I mean, performance has always been super critical for any business, right? So back in the day when we were still standing in lines to get stuff done, like at the bank or something, if it took too long, you'd be like, well, I'll probably come back again. And if it happened to you for a couple times, then you'd be seriously thinking about changing your bank, right? And that's what happens with business, because applications are running the business right now, and software is really defining the business right now. So if you don't have the right performance, if you don't have the right user experience, you stand to lose users, and that's really impacting your bottom line. So.
And I suppose there are metrics on this, measurements of, when people bail out or give up, and what that costs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially now with mobile, those kind of metrics are becoming, more and more kind of important. But you start with the basic performance kind of metrics on, what's being used in the app, what part of the app is being used, where are your users really coming from, geographically, what city, what state, what country, things like that. Right. So there's a lot of really key metrics that you're now starting to monitor, with this.
That's actually the next thing I wanted to ask, and Rob will throw it back to you.
Sure.
Just tell us a little bit about, for a company that's just kind of coming into this, or coming to a company like yours, what is sort of the basic set of measurements that you might look at with regard to the performance of their app?
Yeah, I think the way when we talk to customers, the first thing that we tell them is you have to be really honest with yourself about how your app is actually performing. Yeah. We've had instances where a CEO will be using their app, they'll see a crash, and they'll say, oh, the world is falling over, we need to fix this. To go down to the engineering team, tell them to fix this issue, they have no idea what to fix. So one of the first issues is really around user experience, as Bhaskar was saying, just how often does your app crash? What's the crash rate of my app? is one of the first things that you look at. And the second thing is really around, after crash rate is how long things take to complete in your app. How long does checkout take to complete? And measuring latencies in your app. We have companies just throwing in SDKs in their app for advertising, for analytics, and they have no idea how these impact your app. And so really measuring these two things. And then after that, it's measuring with each version of your app, how are you improving over time?
I find that last thing very interesting. I mean, the APKs plugging in, and that's getting very common with all the advertising analytics and all that thing, and that can really weigh down your app and affect performance.
Yeah, I mean, we had, and it's crazy. Even large companies, like we were talking to a $100 billion financial services company, and one of their developers just added an analytics SDK to their app. They didn't tell management, and that SDK ended up crashing their app. They had no idea this was happening, and this was costing them real money. They had no idea until they started using a product like ours.
Yeah. Bhaskar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of just the basic set of metrics you're measuring, I mean, it starts out with, the basic KPIs, right? I mean, what's being accessed, what's the performance, what's the load time, how much time is being accessed. So if you apply that to, say, a travel app or something, what's being searched for, how much time is sort of like a hotel search taking versus how much time is a, flight search taking, things like those. Then you kind of move on to, where are your users coming from? That's really important, helps the business really understand kind of where to focus on, right? And then obviously, like Rob said, the crash metrics. The mobile platforms are still kind of maturing. The apps crash a lot. That's just a way of life right now. So that's why the crash stuff becomes really important. And also analytics. So the one aspect, some of the good examples that Rob had in terms of the post-crash, what happens in terms of completion. But also, crashes lead to abandonment. And then also crashes, there's a lot of variance in how crashes occur. Is it a new version of the app that's, causing the crash? Is it a old version of iOS that's causing the crash? So there's a whole bunch of factors to be really looking at. So it's really those basic metrics that we're helping with.
And that's what's really unique about mobile. So one of my favorite stories was we were working with a large gaming company. And we walked into their office, and we were walking to the kitchen. There was an engineer there. We heard this banging of a door, an opening of a door. And we were like, what is going on? And so we walked over to the engineer, and literally he was taking his phone, hitting a button, opening the microwave, throwing it in there, and then closing the door. And we asked him, what are you doing? Are you crazy? And he said, well, there's this crash that happens only when I lose internet connectivity in this one instance. And, and he was trying to replicate it, and he couldn't replicate it. And I think that's what's interesting at mobile is it's very, connectivity, people lose internet, people, there's memory issues, there's very unique issues that are very unique to mobile that you just can't test for.
And that's actually really interesting also, because that's one reason you have to do it in real traffic. A lot of sort of performance management has traditionally been done, in the pre-production type of scenarios and things like that. But with mobile, I mean, it'll all work great when you test it out in your lab and everything else. But there's so much variance out there, carrier, bandwidth, and everything else, that you just have to have it instrumented and have to have it running in production.
This isn't something we really talked about, but just as a point of interest, I mean, what do you have to do to deal with all there's a bunch of different networks and there's a billion different devices. How do you deal with all that? I mean, do you have to, you can't test everything. I mean.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies try to use testing companies to do it, and I think we still recommend that because there's a good amount of testing that you can do to find issues, but really it's about taking your app, putting it into production, and just seeing what happens. And seeing what metrics you get back.
Right. Bhaskar, is there a metric where you can show customers what the crash to bailout ratio is, or how many people are giving up after one crash or two crashes?
Yeah, absolutely, especially as you start tracking more of the active users, more also as you start tracking deeper metrics. So for example, we saw someone from Airbnb talk about we're really wanting to track deeper metrics. It's not just about the first level downloads and everything else, but deeper conversion and things like that. So the more you start tracking deeper metrics like those into how they're translating into the functionality of the application, conversion into something real. It could be a sale, it could be something that you're buying, right? And then you match that up with what the user is, right? Because again, identity on the mobile, who the user was, and you try to match them up together, then you get a pretty good sense of what the effect is on a segment, on a bunch of users, et cetera.
Okay. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about mobile is also that there's different metrics that we see companies typically track in terms of how they affect their business metrics. So, for example, Facebook tracks a metric called time to first interaction.
Yeah.
So it's the time it takes from when you hit launch an app to the user actually doing something. And that's a metric that a lot of companies want to track or are tracking today, and seeing how adding new functionality to the app affects that metric, and really tying these operational analytics to kind of these business metrics that companies are tracking, I think has been very important for a lot of companies.
Okay. Well, that leads to the next point. I mean, we've covered some of the basic measurements that can be made, and you've even talked about some of the slightly more complex measurement. What is difficult to measure, and what do you think as we move on with this relatively new science or practice? What types of things are we going to be looking at in the future that's going to really help customers?
Yeah, a couple things, right? So once you're past the basic metric set of here's how things are performing and things like that, what we've seen customers really struggle with is what is normal. Right? Just learning what's normal, because once you're measuring a whole lot of things, there's so many numbers out there that it's really hard to judge what is normal. So one of the things that we help them with is we have a self-learning mechanism which we can apply to performance metrics and say, here's how it does on a Monday, here's how it does on a Wednesday, different times of the day, different times of the week, and help them establish a baseline based on which they can say, this is good versus this is bad. Because you don't want to look at like 1,000 metrics and say, that's 500 milliseconds, this is a second, and go all over that. But you want your tooling to learn that for you. And that's one of the big things that we help with.
Yeah, I think one of the things is you can analyze your own metrics, and I think that's really important. But I think mobile is so new, people don't know what the norms are. Yeah. So we had this great conversation with a set of our customers, and we were talking about the crash rate in your app, and the latencies in your app. And we got into almost this fist fight between our customers, because one customer said, oh, my crash rate is 2%. One customer said, my crash rate is 1%. Yeah. And they're really duking it out. And that really just speaks to, people don't know what are the norms for mobile, what you should be tracking. How do you compare against other apps that are your competitors or other apps that are in your industry?
Yeah. Well, is there a norm that you can tell us about now, or does it vary by app type?
Yeah, so we actually released a report a couple months ago. It was called the Mobile Benchmark, Crittercism Mobile Benchmark. And we found that on average is about 1% to 2% is the average across our customers. So obviously, after they used us, the crash rate went down. But a large percentage, I think like 47% of the apps didn't hit that range. So a lot of these apps, and it didn't matter, and there's no correlation between the size of the app, how many users, and how well the app was performing, which was interesting. So we have indie apps, we have large companies, and they all have problems. Yeah. And the other interesting thing was latencies in apps, looking at network requests. So we found that there's about 6 different services an app uses. So a service, anything from an analytics SDK to an ad SDK to their own CDN, things like that. And that creates a huge amount of complexity in apps, because now it's not just talking to your own API, it's talking to Facebook, it's talking to Twitter. If any of those services go down, that affects your app as well. And we found that 9% of the time, these service calls were actually failing, and that could really cause issues with your app.
Yeah. Bhaskar?
Yeah, there's a lot of external dependencies, and that makes it really hard. Also in terms of just having some sort of baseline, we actually did a recent survey with 1,000 people in the US and the UK, polling them about mobile performance, and we saw that anytime there's more than 3 seconds of mobile experience, you click on something, you wait for it, and if it's taking more than 3 seconds, there's about a 60% abandonment rate of people stopping to use that functionality.
Wow.
So that's how critical. So some of those numbers are really serious. straightforward. But then, it's really complex in terms of how many external dependencies you have and everything else. And I think the other dependency I want to quickly point out is your apps are essentially now basically talking to apps on your server. So it's also important to have an end-to-end monitoring strategy where you're monitoring your mobile apps, but you're also monitoring your apps on the server because it has the same kind of impact as well. So that's another really key thing.
All right, we're starting to run out of time here, so a couple of lightning round questions for you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You guys are both pretty new companies. If I'm considering doing business with you, how are you going to tell me how you're different than some of maybe the older guard companies that do this type of work? Can we start with you, Bhaskar?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, I think if you look at the core values of what we do, it's really focusing on customer success. It's making customers successful rather than just selling software, and putting it on the shelf, which traditionally happens a lot with enterprise software, and really kind of focusing on figuring out what their needs are, and then aligning your roadmap to kind of what they're looking for and things like that. So that would be the single value, I would say. And then also, like in terms of innovation, taking risks and sort of like staying ahead of the curve is how you sort of like really stand out in that terms.
All right, but just in terms of the sophistication of the measurements or techniques that you use,
Sure.
I mean, can you drill down a little bit on that? I mean, what's the new game?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of pointed out some of the baselining techniques we use and how it is really to do more analytics. So both in performance as well as business metrics, it's important to do analytics, right? So even with performance, again, variance is a big factor. What is causing it? Because in a very normal circumstance, when you run a test, it might all run okay. Yeah. So how do you sort of like figure out what the variance is? Is it the carrier? Is it sort of like the bandwidth aspect? And it's really, if you could basically make your monitoring screens point out the problem, you've gotten like really ahead in the game because you now don't have to troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong. Okay. The monitoring screens are telling you that fact.
Let's give Rob the last word.
Sure. So I think for us, it's really the focus on mobile. Like we started off as mobile app developers. We created a product for ourselves, and really we've been focused on mobile. And we'll continue to focus on mobile. So let me give you another great story from it was a major retailer. So they were using the product. They found out that for 30 minutes every day, users were unable to check out in their app. They had no idea this was happening. And what's funny is they were using a server-side monitoring tool. It didn't tell them anything. And the reason they found this was because there's connectivity issues between their phone and their servers. Their servers were overloaded. The requests weren't even getting hit on their server. And it's just a very unique to mobile problem. I was talking about the microwave story earlier. I think that's a very common issue across companies. There's just a huge complexity with fragmentation, with connectivity, without having root access to a server. That's very unique to mobile, and that will be kind of our focus in making sure that people, as they're developing mobile-first apps, mobile-first companies, that we support them.
All right, good. Well, that's about it for the time. I think you guys both have really fascinating companies, and of course, we're going to continue to write about you. And thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Cool.
Let's have a hand for these guys.